The barn was already burning when Eleanor Cross ran into it. Smoke rolled black against the night sky, and somewhere behind her she heard Caleb shouting her name, but her hands were already closing around the handle of the trunk buried under a pile of feed sacks, and she was not leaving without it. Heat licked at her sleeve. A support beam groaned somewhere above. She coughed, eyes streaming, and dragged the trunk 2 feet before Caleb's arms closed around her waist and hauled her backward, out through the door, into the cold night air, both of them collapsing into the dirt as the roof caved in behind them with a sound like the world ended. "Are you out of your mind?" Caleb's voice cracked with something that wasn't anger, not really. His hands were on her face, checking for burns, checking that she was whole. "It's wood and feed, Eleanor. It's not worth your life." She didn't answer him. She was staring at the trunk she dragged clear, at the singed corner of it, and thinking that he was wrong. It was worth more than he knew. It was worth everything. 3 weeks earlier, she had stepped off the train with that same trunk and nothing else. No family waiting, no friends, just a name on a letter, and an address for a rancher named Caleb Whitfield who needed a wife the way a man needs a second pair of hands, not the way a man needs a heart. She had answered his advertisement because it asked for practicality, not romance. Because the last time a man in her life had wanted her for anything, it had ended in ruin. Caleb had met her at the station without flowers, without pretense. "You'll have your own room," he'd said before she'd even set her trunk down. "Wages, same as I'd pay a hired hand plus board. My daughter doesn't speak. Hasn't since her mother died. I won't pretend that's easy to live around, and I won't pretend this is anything but an arrangement. If that suits you, we'll manage fine." It had suited her, more than he could have known. Me was 7 years old with her father's stubborn jaw and her mother's eyes, and she watched Eleanor from doorways for the first 2 days without a single word, without so much as a whisper. Eleanor didn't try to coax her. She simply worked, mended the torn hem of Me's dress without being asked, left a second biscuit on the girl's plate every morning, hummed low under her breath while she swept, never once demanding anything back. On the third day, Me sat 2 feet closer at supper. On the fifth, she handed Eleanor a smooth gray stone she'd found by the creek, solemn as a queen bestowing a gift, and said nothing, but her eyes said, "I see you trying." Eleanor understood silence. She had lived inside her own for 2 years. She had been married once, to a man named Thomas Cross, a businessman with soft hands and a softer voice, who told her when he courted her that he wanted to build something that would outlast them both. She hadn't understood then what he meant to build it from. It was only after his death, a seizure of the heart, sudden, almost merciful in its speed, that she'd opened his private ledger and understood exactly what his fortune was made of. Families back home who'd lost their land to rigged surveys, water rights bought out from under them through men Thomas had paid to falsify claims, debts called in early and often on families who had no way to pay, forcing them to sign their futures over for pennies. She had lived in a fine house on the profits of other people's ruin and hadn't known it, or hadn't let herself know it, which she was coming to understand might be the same sin wearing a gentler face. She hadn't touched a cent of it since. She'd taken the bank drafts, because burning them felt like erasing the evidence rather than answering for it. And she'd taken the ledger, and she'd come west with both buried in the lining of her trunk, telling herself she would decide what to do with blood money once she was far enough away to think clearly. She had wanted, more than anything, to be seen as a woman who could sweep a floor and mend a hem and hum a tune to a silent child, not as the widow of a man whose name still made grown men flinch in the right rooms back east. She should have known money like that didn't stay buried. Caleb noticed things. That was the trouble with him. For a man who claimed to want nothing more than a practical arrangement, he watched her with an attention that unsettled her more than any romantic gesture could have. He noticed when she flinched at the mention of banks. He noticed the way her hand went still over the ledger books when she balanced the ranch accounts, as though touching numbers reminded her of something she didn't want to remember. He never asked. That, more than anything, was what began to soften something in her chest she'd thought had gone to stone. "You don't have to tell me anything," he said one evening, after me had gone to bed, the two of them sitting on the porch with the last of the coffee gone cold between them. "But I'd know if you were carrying something heavy. I've carried enough myself to recognize the weight of it on somebody else." "Your wife," Eleanor said quietly. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded, looking out at the dark line of the ridge. "Sarah died fighting the Larkin survey. They tried to redraw the water boundary through our south pasture, said the county had made an error 20 years back. She rode to town in a storm to file papers proving otherwise. Horse threw her crossing the creek. I've spent 2 years telling myself it was an accident of weather, not an accident of men wanting what wasn't theirs." "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered, and meant it with a force that surprised her. "So." He turned to her, steady, patient, no demand in his face at all. "What's yours?" She almost told him. She got as far as opening her mouth, the shape of my husband forming on her tongue, when the sound of hoofbeats on the road stopped her cold, and a rider she didn't recognize came up the drive in the moonlight, hat pulled low, smiling before he'd even dismounted. "Mrs. Cross," the stranger said, swinging down easily. "Forgive the late hour. My name is Edmund Hargrove. I believe you and I have some business to discuss." Eleanor's blood went to ice. She knew that name. She had seen it on the ledger pages a dozen times, always beside Thomas's, always attached to the worst of it, the falsified deeds, the water claims bought through bribery, the families forced out with nothing. Hargrove had been Thomas's partner in everything, the silent architect behind half the ruin her husband's public name had taken credit for. "You have the wrong woman," she said, though her voice betrayed her. "I don't think I do." Hargrove's smile didn't waver. He glanced at Caleb with the easy, practiced warmth of a man who'd spent his whole life talking himself into rooms he had no right to be in. "Mr. Whitfield, is it? Forgive the intrusion. I only mean to look after an old friend's widow." Thomas would have wanted someone keeping an eye on her, given the complications of his estate. "There's no estate," Eleanor said. "Nothing that concerns you. There's a rather significant sum of company money that walked out the door with you, Eleanor, and legally speaking, that money belongs to the business, not to a grieving widow who took it in a moment of poor judgment." His voice stayed gentle, reasonable, the voice of a man who believed his own lies so thoroughly they'd stopped sounding like lies to him. "I'm not here to make trouble. I'm here to see it return to its rightful use. That's all. I'd hate for this to become complicated. For you, or for your new situation here." The threat sat under his words like a snake under a porch step, and Eleanor heard every coil of it. Caleb stood slowly, unhurried, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there a moment before. "It's late, Mr. Hargrove. You'll want to be riding on." Hargrove's eyes flicked between them, cataloging, calculating. "Of course, I'll be in town a few days, plenty of time to discuss this properly without an audience." He tipped his hat, mounted, and rode off into the dark, and Eleanor stood frozen on the porch until she realized she was shaking. "Eleanor." Caleb's voice was careful. "What was that?" "I need to think," she said, and fled inside before he could see her face crumble. She didn't sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed with the ledger open on her lap, reading names she'd memorized without meaning to. The Alvarez family, driven off land they'd farmed 3 generations. The Whitcombs, ruined by a called debt 2 weeks after a bad harvest, dozens more, each one a small grave she'd been carrying without ever having dug it herself. She thought of Sarah Whitfield, dead in a creek fighting a different water survey by a different set of greedy men, and she wondered how many Hargroves there were in the world, circling towns like this one, waiting for a widow or a wife too tired to fight back. She would not be too tired. The next days were a slow tightening of the noose. Hargrove was seen in town, charming the banker, charming the sheriff, dropping careful hints over card games that the new Mrs. Whitfield might not be quite what she seemed, that there were questions about her past, about money that wasn't hers, that a man ought to know what he was bringing under his roof. Rumor moved through a small town the way fire moves through dry grass, and by the fourth day Eleanor could feel the difference in how the shopkeeper's wife looked at her, the way conversation stopped a half-beat too late when she walked in. "They're talking," Caleb said grimly, coming in from town with his jaw tight. "Hargrove's telling people you're hiding something. Won't say what. Just enough to make them wonder." "He's telling the truth," Eleanor said, and the words tasted like penance. "I am hiding something." She told him everything then, sitting across the kitchen table with the ledger between them like a confession laid on an altar. Thomas, the ruined families, the bank draft sewn into her trunk lining, Hargrove's part in all of it and his threat now dressed up as concern. She watched Caleb's face while she spoke, braced for the moment his eyes would change, the moment the practical arrangement would curdle into something colder. It didn't come. "You didn't do this," he said when she finished. "You inherited a debt you never signed for. That's not the same as owing it. I lived on that money for years and never asked where it came from. That makes me part of it. It makes you human." Caleb reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, close enough that she felt the warmth of it anyway. "The question isn't whether you're guilty of not knowing. It's what you do now that you do." Me, who'd been sitting silent in the corner mending a quilt square, looked up at that, and for the first time since Eleanor had arrived, the girl spoke, one small, cracked sentence, barely above a whisper. "Don't let him win." Both adults turned to her, stunned, and me ducked her head, embarrassed by her own voice, but she didn't take it back. That night the barn burned. Eleanor never found out for certain whether it was Hargrove's men or hired hands paid to make her frightened enough to hand the money over quietly, but she didn't need proof to know the shape of it. Fire was exactly the kind of warning a man like Hargrove would send, one that could be blamed on a dropped lantern, one that cost her everything without a single fingerprint pointing back to him. She ran into the flames for the ledger because it was the only weapon she had left, and when Caleb pulled her clear and me screamed her name into the smoke. The girl's first full sentence in 2 years, torn raw from a throat that hadn't dared trust the world enough to speak in Eleanor, understood that hiding was no longer a door available to her. Every path forward led through the open. She called a town meeting for the following evening. Caleb tried to talk her out of nothing because he understood, better than she'd expected, that this wasn't a decision that needed saving from. He only asked to stand beside her, and she let him. The meeting hall was full by the time she arrived, half curiosity, half appetite for scandal, Hargrove seated near the front with the calm smile of a man who believed he'd already won. Eleanor walked to the front with the ledger in her hands, singed at the corner, smoke still faintly clinging to its pages, and she did not wait to be invited to speak. "My name is Eleanor Cross," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I was married to Thomas Cross, a businessman many of you have never heard of, from a town most of you will never visit. I came here a widow, calling myself a plain woman looking for a practical arrangement, and that much was true. What I didn't say was that my husband built his fortune by ruining families exactly like yours, falsified land surveys, bought water claims, debts called in to force decent people off decent land. I didn't say it because I was ashamed, and because I hoped that if I buried it far enough away, it would stop being mine to answer for. A murmur rolled through the room. Hargrove's smile had gone thin. This man, Eleanor continued, turning to face him directly, Edmund Hargrove, was my husband's partner in every piece of it. He didn't come here out of concern for a grieving widow. He came because he wants what's left of that money for himself, and he's willing to burn a family's barn to the ground to frighten me into handing it over quietly. She opened the ledger. It's all here. Names, dates, every family that lost land or water or a livelihood to the two of them. I intend to read it in full tonight so that no one in this room has to wonder any longer what kind of man is sitting among you. This is absurd, Hargrove said, rising, his composure cracking at the edges. A grieving widow's fevered imagination. Then you won't mind the sheriff comparing the handwriting in this ledger to the survey filings on record at the county office, Caleb said evenly, standing at Eleanor's shoulder. Because I rode out this morning and requested exactly that comparison. Should be here within the hour. Hargrove's face went the color of old ash. Eleanor read. She read names until her voice grew hoarse and the room grew utterly silent, the kind of silence that comes when people recognize, uncomfortably, that this same pattern of quiet theft and rigged claims was not confined to some far-off town. It was the very shape of what had cost Sarah Whitfield her life 2 years before, the same water rights scheme dressed in new clothes. By the time she finished, the room's sympathy had turned entirely, and Hargrove found no friendly face left to retreat to. Within the week he'd be run out of town for good, his name attached now to ruin instead of respectability. There's one more thing, Eleanor said, before the room could fully disperse into its shock and whispering. The money my husband made from all of this, I won't spend a cent of it on myself. I'm signing every dollar of those bank drafts over to fund this town's water rights fight, the same fight that took Sarah Whitfield's life. If there's a family here who's been threatened the way the Larkins threatened this ranch, I want to make sure you never have to choose between your land and your safety again. The room broke into something between applause and stunned silence, and somewhere in the back, Eleanor caught the eye of the shopkeeper's wife who'd been looking at her sideways all week. The woman was crying openly, nodding at her like an apology. It was 3 days later, the papers signed, the fund established, Hargrove's name already fading into the kind of story people would tell as a warning rather than a threat, that Caleb found her on the porch at dusk, the rebuilt barn's frame rising pale and new against the darkening sky. You did that on your own, he said. All of it. You didn't need me to fix a single piece of it. I know, she said. Good. He turned to face her fully, hat in his hands, something unguarded in his face she hadn't seen since the night he'd told her about Sarah. Because I'm not asking you to marry me so you'll have someone to fix things for you. I'm asking because me speaks again and she speaks your name, and because I haven't stopped thinking about you since you dragged a burning trunk out of my barn like it held your whole soul in it. May I court you properly, Eleanor, not for wages, not for me's sake, for yours, for mine. She looked at him a long moment, at the porch, at the rebuilt barn, at the life she had not expected to want and now could not imagine losing, and she said yes. If this story pulled at something in you, hit that like button before you go. It tells us to keep making more. Subscribe if you want the next frontier story delivered straight to you, because there's always another woman out west proving she's stronger than whatever's trying to bury her. And drop a comment below. What would you have done with Eleanor's fortune? We read every single one. A year later, the water fund had already saved 2 families from losing their land to a fresh round of surveys, and the ledger sat framed behind glass in the town hall, not as a monument to shame, but as a promise kept, that this town, at least, would answer for what it knew. Me rode ahead of them down to the creek most evenings now, chattering the way children do when they've finally remembered how. And Eleanor Whitfield stood on the porch of the rebuilt barn beside the husband who'd never once asked her to be anything but exactly, entirely herself, and understood, finally, that some inheritances are worth burying, and some fortunes are only real once you've given them away.